Mr. President, thank you for your time. The US Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, was through the area on the weekend. What did you learn from his and the stance from the United States? Morning, Mr. President.
Good morning. We had a good discussion, me and Secretary of State Marco Rubio. He's actually met a few regional leaders already in Munich and has continued now. He's going to Saudi Arabia and to the Gulf states. I think it's a very important trip of his because it's his first trip as Secretary of State. And as you can see, in the first month of Donald Trump, he's definitely shaking up our region. And I hope there will be a trajectory of moving forward, of offering a real hope to the people of the region.
Mr. President, shaking up is undoubtedly true, but what do you mean by that?
Look, we've gone through this vicious cycle again and again. Okay, terror attacks after terror attacks, then the horrific October 7th, then war, then ceasefire. But what's next? How do we make sure that this doesn't recur? For decades, this recurs because of terror, because of this jihadist notion that, we prefer dying rather than living, but we are a nation that prefers living rather than dying. And there is a trajectory in the region of Israel's inclusion in the region, of moving to peace between Jew and Muslim. For that, we have to overcome terror and bring back our hostages. I just came back from meeting a family of hostages that came out. I mean, this was so moving. We are marking 500 days to October 7th, 500 days to them being abducted and kidnapped.
500 days, Mr. President. And while we must celebrate the safe release of 3 more hostages on the weekend, the rate at which they are being released, there are many more months before everyone is out. I would imagine that's intolerable for you, intolerable for the families, intolerable for Israel. What needs to be done?
Absolutely intolerable. This is the agreement that was reached. Now we have to enter into the dialogue on the second stage of the release, which of course will entail very painful steps. Your listeners and viewers ought to know Israel is releasing arch terrorists to get back our sons and daughters. We are extremely worried about the children, the Bibas kids, and we're worried about the elderly, 86-year-old Mr. Shlomo Manso and others, Oded Lifshitz and others, and of course, ordinary people who were taken from their beds on October 7th. We have to condense it. We have to find a mechanism to condense the process and, of course, see how we make sure that this vicious cycle doesn't recur, meaning Hamas stays, takes over, beefs itself up with enormous amount of equipment and ammunition from Iran or what's not, smuggling money, and then again another eruption and another terror attack. Israelis won't accept it. And by the way, most leaders in the region won't accept it. And I think we should find, like what we say, circle the square or square the circle in order both to get the hostages out and make sure that there will be a real change in between us and Gaza.
If we talk about the release of hostages, Mr. President, earlier this month, Ohad Ben Ami, Or Levi and Eli Sherabi were released, and they looked in terrible condition. I don't wish to cause you any offence, but it was almost as if they were in Belsen. How did you react when you saw their emaciated skeleton?
So my late father was the president of Israel as well and was a senior ranking military officer in the British Army in World War II and liberated Bergen-Belsen. He always told me how he met the people. I just came back from meeting Ohad Ben Ami. It was an amazing meeting because the guy really went through hunger. And he told me how he spoke to his captors about, them not eating or seeing any piece of food or water for a long time. This was a shocking scene. By the way, Eli Sharabi's wife was British. She was Leanne Sharabi. She was from Bristol, and she was murdered, and the daughters were murdered on October 7th. And when I spoke to Sharabi the day after he came back, he was still, bereaving heavily because he was only notified when he got out. So these are huge human tragedies. And the key to the change in the Middle East is the hostage deal and getting back all of them home.
Another key is Gaza, Mr. President. Prime Minister Netanyahu has said that he and President Trump have a, quotes, common strategy. What do you understand that strategy to be?
So I don't want to go into the details because, as president, I'm not in the executive. It's quite similar to the European system, and the president is the head of state, but the executive is in the prime minister's hand in the government. But the strategy, as I see President Trump's strategy, is calling the bluff of all the partners concerned and saying, guys, you want to repeat the same mistake again and again? You want more bloodshed, or you want to change the course of history to something else? It's about time that the region recognizes the nation state of the Jewish people, the state of Israel, that we carve out a real peace process. But for that, honestly, we have to undermine terror and eradicate it, or do whatever we can to eradicate it. You guys went through that process in Ireland, and other nations have gone through it. When I spoke to the US Congress in the joint session just 3 months before October 7th, I explained that terror undermines any peace process. Now, the terror is instigated by Tehran, and we have to challenge Tehran and make sure, and that was Marco Rubio's main statement yesterday, Iran is the head of the snake.
But for the Northern Ireland peace process to work, Mr. President, there had to be considerable concessions, not least the release of many IRA supposed terrorists. Would Israel be as prepared to go in a similar direction?
So I'm not going into all the details, but if you look honestly at this process of the hostage deal, we are releasing the worst terrorists possible, imaginable, in cases that are tearing our hearts. There were two young children, really toddlers, who were murdered by an arch terrorist 25 years ago, and their names were similar to the names of my sons. And now this terrorist was released now for the three that hostages who came back over the weekend. So our nation is pained to and agonized by releasing these terrorists. And at the end, in order to move, we have to make sure that jihadist terror doesn't reign. It's not that you can explain it like in the process in Ireland. This is like a religious belief in terror and dying. And this is the difference here.
How is the ratio worked out, Mr. President? The total of around 144, I believe, hostages have been released back to Israel, but more than 1,000 Palestinians, prisoners, have been released. How is the ratio to be determined?
So it was negotiated in Qatar, in the negotiations in Qatar, and I don't really know how it was built. It was a consent that was reached between all parties concerned, and with the direct involvement of President Trump's envoy, Steve Witkoff, who has been extremely, proactive and successful after a long process, which we held also with the American administration before, and the Egyptians and Qataris. So that's the formula that was reached. Now we have to enter the second stage, which is even more complicated than that. But I would say you have to understand that there's a psychological element here. Imagine any one of your listeners seeing, Liverpool being conquered, or Bath, or any other town, and butchered and slaughtered. That's what we feel since October 7th. And that's what we went to defend ourselves. Now, in order to change that course, we have to see how we make sure that our neighbors right nearby don't swarming again. Right. They've murdered and butchered the biggest supporters of peace in Israel. These kibbutzim members were their partners of the Gazan people for decades.
Finally, the scenes on the weekend, I know that for there to be peace, you and the Prime Minister says Hamas has to be defeated. But, Mr. President, if you looked at that scenes at the weekend, there would appear to be no shortage of Hamas terrorists who were heavily armed and ready to carry on the fight. How did you feel in your heart when you saw those images of the three being released, which is good news, but the extraordinary rank numbers of Hamas fighters, it would seem, ready to continue the fight?
So it's mind-boggling, and you get really mad and angry. But once you look at it from a bird's eye view, you see that these people, some of them were mobilized on the spot and put on uniforms. We know that there are terrorists still in Gaza, and we are not eluding ourselves. There are areas we did not go in operationally in order not to endanger our hostages. So we know there are Hamas terrorists there, we felt extremely unpleasant and angry, and it's also a humiliating process. But at the end of it, we're stronger than that. We understand as a nation that we're going through a painful process, but we are retrieving and bringing back our loved ones. And that is the most important thing that is affecting our national psyche these days.
How confident are you that all of the hostages who are still alive, you will get back alive, Mr. President?
Look, we all want it. Israelis of all facets of lives and all opinions want it. Naturally, as I said to you, there are fears because when you're releasing terrorists, you can assume that many of them will want to go back to terror. This is our experience for previous deals. So we are torn. This is something that is tormenting and aching and painful. But at the end, we took a decision which is clear to us. We opt for those who we know are alive and we want to rescue and bring them back from the dungeons and horrors of Gaza. And we will have to make sure that these terrorists, will have to prevent them from going back or arrest them once we know that they went back to terror. The risks are there, unfortunately.
Very grateful for your time. Good luck with your efforts to bring about peace in the region. Thank you, sir. Isaac Herzog, President of Israel. You're listening to LBC. It's 9:52.